Chapter 13 of The Story of Ab. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. The Story of Ab by Stanley Waterloo. Chapter 13. Ab's Great Discovery. It may be that never in what was destined to be a life of many changes was Ab happier than in this period of his lusty boyhood and early manhood, when there was so much that was new, when he was full of hope and confidence, and of ambition regarding what a mighty hunter and great man he would become in time. As the years passed he was not less indefatigable in his experiments, and the day came when a marvellous success followed one of them, although, like most inventions, it was suggested in the most trivial and accidental manner. It chanced one afternoon that Ab, a young man of 20 now, had returned early from the wood and was lying lazily upon the sward near the cave's entrance, while not far away Bark and the still chubby Beechleaf were rolling about. The boy was teasing the girl at times, and then doing something to amuse or awe her. He had found a stiff length of twig and was engaged in idly bending the ends together and then letting them fly apart with a snap, meanwhile advancing toward and threatening with the impact the half-alarmed but wholly delighted Beechleaf. Tired of this at last, Bark, with no particular intent, drew forth from the pouch in his skin cloak a string of sinew, and drawing the ends of the strong twig somewhat nearly together, attached the cord to each, thus producing accidentally a petty bow of most rotund proportions. He found that the string twanged joyously, and to the delight of Beechleaf kept twanging it for such a time as his boyish temperament would allow a single occupation. Then he picked from the ground a long, slender pencil of whitewood, a sliver, perhaps, from the making of a spear shaft, and began strumming with it upon the taut sinew string. This made a twang of a new sort, and again the boy and girl were interested temporarily. But at last even this variation of amusement with the new toy became monotonous, and Bark ceased strumming and began a series of boyish experiments with his plaything. He put one end of the stick against the string and pushed it back until the other end would press against the inside of the twig, and the result would be a taut new figure in wood and string, which would keep its form even when laid upon the ground. Bark made and unmade the thing a time or two, and then came great disaster. He had drawn the little stick, so held in the way we now call arrow-wise, back nearly to the point where its head would come inside the bent twig and there fix itself, when the slight thing escaped his hands and flew away. The quiet of the afternoon was broken by a piercing, childish yell, which lacked no element of earnestness. Ab leapt to his feet, and was by the youngsters in a moment. He saw the terrified Beechleaf standing, screaming still, with a fat arm outheld, from which dangled a little shaft of wood which had pierced the flesh just deeply enough to give it hold. Bark stood looking at her, astonished and alarmed. Understanding nothing of the circumstances, and supposing the girl's hurt came from Bark's careless flinging of sticks towards her, Ab started toward his brother to administer one of those buffets which were so easy to give or get among cave children. But Bark darted behind a convenient tree, and there shrieked out his innocence of dire intent, just as the boy of to-day so fluently defends himself in any strait where castigation looms in sight. He told of the queer plaything he had made, and offered to show how all had happened. Ab was doubtful, but laughing now, for the little shaft, which had scarcely pierced the skin of Beechleaf's arm, had fallen to the ground, and that young person's fright had given way to vengeful indignation, and she was demanding that Bark be hit with something. He allowed the sinner to give his proof. Bark, taking his toy, essayed to show how Beechleaf had been injured. He was the most unfortunate of youths. He succeeded but too well. The mimic arrow flew again, and the sound that rang out now was not the cry of a child. It was the yell of a great youth, who felt a sudden and poignant hurt, and who was not maintaining any dignity. Had Bark been as sure of hand and certain of aim as any archer who lived in later centuries, he could not have sent an arrow more fairly to its mark than he sent that admirable sliver into the chest of his big brother. For a second the culprit stood with staring eyes, then dropped his toy and flew into the forest with a howl, which betokened his fear of something little less than sudden death. Ab's first impulse was to pursue his sinful younger brother, but after the first leap he checked himself and paused to pluck away the thing which, so light the force that had impelled it, had not gone deeply in. He knew now that Bark was really blameless, and, picking up the abandoned plaything, began its examination thoughtfully and curiously. The young man's instinct toward experiment exhibited itself as usual, and he put the splinter against the string and drew it back and let it fly as he had seen Bark do, that promising sprig, by the way, being now engaged in peering from the wood and trying to form an estimate as to whether or not his return was yet advisable. Ab learned that the force of the bent twig would throw the sliver farther than he could toss it with his hand, and he wondered what would follow were something like this plaything, the device of which Bark had so stumbled upon, to be made and tried on a greater scale. "I'll make one like it, only larger," he said to himself. The venturesome but more or less diplomatic Bark had, by this time, emerged from the wood and was apprehensively edging up toward the place where Ab was standing. The older brother saw him and called to him to come and try the thing again, and the youngster knew that he was safe. Then the two toyed with the plaything for an hour or two, and Ab became more and more interested in its qualities. He had no definite idea as to its possibilities. He thought only of it as a curious thing which should be larger. The next day Ab hacked from a low-limbed tree a branch as thick as his finger and about a yard in length, and first trimming it, bent it as Bark had bent the twig, and tied a strong sinew cord across. It was a not discreditable bow, considering the fact that it was the first ever made, though one end was smaller than the other, and it was rough of outline. Then Ab cut a straight willow twig, as long nearly as the bow, and began repeating the experiments of the day before. Never was man more astonished than this youth after he had drawn the twig back nearly to its head and let it go. So drawn by a strong arm, the shaft when released flew faster and farther than the maker of what he thought of chiefly as a thing of sport had imagined could be possible. He had longed to search for the headless arrow, and when he found it he went away to where were bare open stretches, that he might see always where it fell. Once as he sent it from the string it struck fairly against an oak, and pointless as it was, forced itself deeply into the hard brown bark, and hung there quivering. Then came to the youth a flash of thought which had its effect upon the ages. What if there had been a point to the flying thing, and it had struck a reindeer or any of the hunted animals? He pulled the shaft from the tree and stood there pondering for a moment or two, then suddenly started running toward the cave. He must see old Mok. The old man was at work and alone, and the young man told him, somewhat excitedly, why he had thus come running to him. The elder listened with some patience, but with a commiserating grin upon his face. He had heard young men tell of great ideas before, of a new and better way of digging pits, or of fishing, or making deadfalls for wild beasts. But he listened and yielded finally to Ab's earnest demand that he should hobble out into the open and see with his own eyes how the strung bow would send the shaft. They went together to an open space, and again Ab showed to his old friend what the new thing would do. With the second shot there came a new light into the eyes of the veteran hunter, and he bade Ab run to the cave and bring back with him his favourite spear. The young man was back as soon as strong legs could bring him, and when he burst into the open he found Mok standing a long spear's cast from the greatest of the trees which stood about the opening. "Throw your spear at the tree," said Mok. "Throw strongly as you can." Ab hurled the spear as the Zulu of later times might hurl his assegai, as strongly and as well, but the distance was overmuch for spear throwing with good effect, and the flint point pierced the wood so lightly that the weight of the long shaft was too great for the holding force, and it sank slowly to the ground and pulled away the head. A wild beast struck by the spear at such distance would have been sorely pricked, but not hurt seriously. "Now take the plaything," said old Mok, "and throw the little shaft at the tree with that." Ab did as he was told, and, poor marksman with his new device, of course missed the big tree repeatedly, broad as the mark was. But when at last the bolt struck the hard trunk fairly, there was a sound which told of the sharpness of the blow, and the headless shaft rebounded back for yards. Old Mok looked upon it all delightedly. "It may be there is something to your plaything," he said to the young man. "We will make a better one, but your shaft is good for nothing. We will make a straighter and stronger one, and upon the end of it we'll put a little spear head, and then we can tell how deeply it will go into the wood. We will work." For days the two laboured earnestly together, and when they came again into the open they bore a stronger bow, one tapered at the end opposite the natural tapering of the branch, so that it was far more flexible and symmetrical than the one they had tried before. They had abundance of ash and yew, and these remained the good bow-wood of all the time of archery. And the shaft was straight and bore a miniature spearhead at its end. The thought of notching the shaft to fit the string came naturally and inevitably. The bow had its first arrow. An old man is not so easily affected as a young one, nor so hopeful, but when the second test was done, the veteran Mok was the wilder and more delighted of the two who shot at the tree in the forest glade. He saw it all. No longer could the spear be counted as the thing with which to do most grievous hurt at a safe distance from whatever might be dangerous. With the better bow and straighter shaft the marksmanship improved. Even for these two callow archers it was not difficult to hit at a distance of a double spear's cast the bole of the huge tree, 2 yards in width at least. And the arrow whistled as if it were a living thing, a hawk seeking its prey, and the flint head was buried so deeply in the wood that both Mok and Ab knew that they had found something better than any weapon the cave man had ever known. There followed many days more of the eager working of the old man and the young one in the cave, and there was much testing of the new device, and finally one morning Ab issued forth armed with his axe and knife, but without his spear. He bore instead a bow, which was the best and strongest the two had yet learned to fashion, and a sheaf of arrows slung behind his back in a quiver made of a hollow section of a mammoth's leg bone, which had long been kicked about the cave. The two workers had drilled holes in the bone and passed thongs through and made a wooden bottom to the thing, and now it had found its purpose. The bow was rude, as were the arrows, and the archer was not yet a certain marksman, though he had practised diligently. But the bow was stiff at least, and the arrows had keen heads of flint, and the arms of the hunter were strong as was the bow. There was a weary and fruitless search for game, but late in the afternoon the youth came upon a slight sheer descent, along the foot of which ran a shallow but broad creek, beyond which was a little grass-grown valley, where were feeding a fine herd of the little deer. They were feeding in the direction of the creek, and the wind blew from them to the hunter, so that no rumour of their danger was carried to them on the breeze. Ab concealed himself among the bushes on the little height, and awaited what might happen. The herd fed slowly toward him. As the deer neared the creek they grouped themselves together about where were the greenest and richest feeding places, and when they reached the very border of the stream they were gathered in a bunch of 100 close together. They were just beyond a spear's cast from the watcher, but this was a test, not of the spear but of the bow, and the most inexperienced of archers, shooting from where Ab was hidden, must strike some one of the beasts in that broad herd. Ab sprang to his feet and drew his arrow to the head. The deer gathered for a second in affright, crowding each other before the wild bursting away together, and then the bowstring twanged and the arrow sang hungrily, and there was the swift thud of hundreds of light feet, and the little glade was almost silent. It was not quite silent, for floundering in its death struggles was a single deer, through which had passed an arrow so fiercely driven that its flint head projected from the side opposite that which it had entered. Half wild with triumph was the youth who bore home the arrow-stricken quarry, and not much more elated was he than the old man, who heard the story of the hunt, and who recognized at once, far more clearly than the younger one, the quality of the new weapon which had been discovered, the thing destined to become the greatest implement both of chase and warfare for thousands of years to come, and which was to be gradually improved, even by these two, until it became more to them than they could yet understand. But the lips of each of the two makers of the bow were sealed for the time. Ab and Old Mok cherished together their mighty secret. End of chapter 13.